Before we introduce our guest speaker, I would like to explain a little bit about what Motorede is trying to do. Now, you'll have to pardon me because we've had quite a few interruptions over the past 2 weeks, which may have made it impossible for me to really get down pat what I'm going to be saying here tonight. So I'll have to read part of it. More than 150 years ago, a visitor to this country declared, "America is great because America is good." Then Alexander de Tocqueville continued, "And when America ceases to be good, it will cease to be great." Ladies and gentlemen, the movement to restore decency was formed because we believe there are forces at work in our country today that are deliberately seeking to destroy the goodness and with it the greatness of our nation. Now, for 2 years, Motorede has been doing its best in film showings, in distributing literature, and through example and precept and educational programs of other types to set an example. And we've touched on subjects such as sex education in the schools, the growing narcotics menace, the teenage music that is used to promote drugs, sex, and revolution, the attack on our families, and the dangers of sensitivity training. Now, in the coming months, we will continue our efforts to alert the people of this community here in Mahopag to these very, very fundamental dangers. I would also like you at this time tonight to keep in mind and listen very closely to what Alan Stang has to say, and then stop and think and make your own decision as to what it is about Motorede that the schools considered so dangerous, apparently, to give us so much trouble as to where we were going to be having our meeting, the difference between whether we were political, whether to not charge a donation, whether not to charge a donation. And in other words, was there something behind it? Are these things happening in our schools? Now, I don't know if they are. And if they're not, our schools deserve our support. But what Mr. Stang has to say tonight is important for all parents to listen to. At this time, I'd like to introduce now Mike Walsh, who will introduce our guest speaker. Mike?
Ladies and gentlemen, for more than 100 years, Americans have taken great pride in their educational system. This pride was not the loud braggart variety, but rather the quiet confidence that our schools and colleges were the finest in the world, our teachers and educators the most dedicated in the world, and our students the most fortunate in the world. But now this quiet pride is becoming outspoken concern. Our colleges are being rocked by bombs, burnings, and disruptions. In high schools, drugs and pornography are promoted almost with impunity, and even many elementary school children are being subjected to experimental sex education, sensitivity training, and even behavior-controlled drugs. What is happening in our schools today is a question more and more Americans are asking. It is a question that demands an answer, for the dangers these examples represent must be resolved. We in Motorede believe that the first step in solving the crises in our schools is understanding what has caused it. Accurate information must precede responsible action. And so, to learn what is happening, how it started, and what concerned Americans can do, we have invited Mr. Alan Stang to be with us tonight. I am sure that many of you are already well aware of Mr. Stang's abilities and accomplishments. He is certainly one of the most outstanding writers and researchers in this country. His authoritative book on the civil rights movement, It's Very Simple, has won wide acclaim and more than 500,000 copies have been distributed. His recent study of the life and actions of John Foster Dulles, entitled The Actor, will remain an important analysis of United States foreign policy for decades to come. Over 1 million reprints of his columns, articles, and speeches have been distributed, and many thousands have heard him speak. Nor is Alan Stang just an armchair student of the contemporary scene. He was on the spot in Chicago in 1968 as revolutionary agitators fomented riots at the Democratic National Convention. He traveled throughout the Southwest getting the true story about an abortive revolt by the Marxist Tejerina movement to create a separate Soviet state in New Mexico, and had his life threatened as a result. And more to the point for tonight's topic, he has seen firsthand what is happening in our schools and has had youthful agitators scream obscenities at him as he tried to talk sense to some students. Tonight, Alan will be talking sense about where our schools went wrong, and I urge all of you to pay careful attention to his analysis of the problem, and even more important, his recommendations for a solution. I am proud to welcome to our community and to introduce to you tonight a man who has earned the respect and admiration of countless Americans, Mr. Alan Stang. Alan.
Ladies and gentlemen, over the last couple of years, more and more Americans have begun worrying about what is happening in our schools, about such strange things as the chaos and the riots, about such things as forced busing, about such things as the astronomical costs, about such things as drug use and the fact that Johnny can't read. More and more Americans are wondering what's behind all these things. And the simple truth is that all these things I mentioned, and many more besides, are simply parts, elements in a gigantic scheme, a conspiracy, run by the few people who control our schools and our government, the aim of which is to use our schools to enslave our people. Now that, ladies and gentlemen, is the very simple truth I am going to demonstrate for you this evening. And the best way to do it is to begin with a look at some of the people and organizations involved, then to take a look at some of their ideas and goals, and then to take a look at some of their methods. So let's, for instance, go back, even before the turn of the century, when a couple named Beatrice and Sidney Webb were already coming from England to visit and plan with their Marxist colleagues who already held positions of importance and influence in American universities. The Webbs were founders and leaders of an outfit called the Fabian Society, which of course was a Marxian socialist gang working to impose Marxian socialism on the people of Great Britain. Lenin, who of course was trying to take over the country of Russia, thought that the work of the Webbs was so important that he translated it from English into Russian so that his followers could read the Webbs, could study the Webbs, and could use what they had learned from the Webbs in their campaign to seize the country of Russia. Indeed, some years later, the Webbs published a book they called Soviet Socialism, A New Civilization, which applauded communism, and it later turned out that that book had actually been written by the Soviet secret police. In 1905, the American followers, the American disciples of this British Fabian Society met in New York City and formed an organization they called the Intercollegiate Socialist Society, the purpose of which, of course, was to do the same thing here in the United States that the Fabian Society had already been doing for many years in Great Britain. Present at the founding conference of the Intercollegiate Socialist Society, there were, for example, Mr. William Z. Foster, who of course later became the head of the Communist Party USA, and a lady named Elizabeth Gurley Flynn, who of course later also became head of the Communist Party USA. The Intercollegiate Socialist Society published a magazine. They called it the Intercollegiate Socialist. One of its editors was a man named Alexander Trachtenberg, a member of the executive committee of the Intercollegiate Socialist Society. Mr. Trachtenberg once wrote in that magazine, "Menaced by foreign military forces, the work of social and economic regeneration is now endangered. The Russian Revolution is the heritage of the world. It must not be defeated by foreign militarism. It must be permitted to develop unhampered." Trachtenberg, who wrote those words, is perhaps best known as a member of the Central Committee of the Communist Party. In February 1920, the Intercollegiate Socialist Society demanded what they called a resort to violence. A resort to violence. In that same year, as you may remember, the Attorney General of the United States was conducting raids on various revolutionary organizations in our country, and probably for that reason, the Intercollegiate Socialist Society decided to change its name so as to take on some protective coloration against those raids. In the next year, 1921, they began calling themselves the League for Industrial Democracy. It was exactly the same organization, they just had changed their name. Chapters of the League for Industrial Democracy were established on college campus after college campus across the United States. Now, who were the leaders of this League for Industrial Democracy previously known as the Intercollegiate Socialist Society. Its leaders included some of the people whose names have become household words in the field of American education. Its leaders included such top American educators, for example, as Professor Harold Rugg, Professor William Hurd Kilpatrick, Professor George S. Counts, who, by the way, was influential in helping Lenin set up the educational system in Russia after Lenin finally had succeeded in seizing the country, and the most famous of all American educators, the father of progressive education himself, Professor John Dewey. As a matter of fact, John Dewey, the founder of progressive education, was at one time the president of the League for Industrial Democracy, previously known as the Intercollegiate Socialist Society, which was working to impose Marxian socialism on the people of the United States. As a matter of fact, ladies and gentlemen, the League for Industrial Democracy, previously headed by John Dewey, is responsible for the creation of still another organization that we're all talking about in the United States, have been talking about over the last few years. I refer, of course, to the communist terrorist organization called Students for a Democratic Society. SDS was originally created as the youth department, the youth division of the League for Industrial Democracy, previously known as the Intercollegiate Socialist Society, the president of which at one time, once again, had been Professor John Dewey. Now, what were these American educationists and their followers after? What were they working toward? What were their goals? Well, for instance, at the 1934 session of the Department of Superintendents of the National Education Association, a man named Willard E. Givens made a speech. In that speech, Mr. Givens said, "Many drastic changes must be made. A dying laissez-faire must be completely destroyed, and all of us, including the owners, must be subjected to a large degree of social control. A large section of our discussion group maintain that the credit agencies, the basic industries, and utilities cannot be centrally planned and operated under private ownership." So Givens supported a scheme for, as he put it, taking these over and operating them at full capacity as a unified national system in the interest of all the people. So what Mr. Givens was recommending, as you have just heard, was the nationalization of pretty nearly everything of value in the United States. In the very next year, perhaps as a reward, the National Education Association made Mr. Givens its executive secretary, and he continued in that position for the next 17 years. This man who recommended the nationalization of everything in our country was the executive secretary, in other words, the man who ran the most prestigious educational organization, the largest educational organization in our country. He ran that organization for 17 years. Also in 1934, in a report prepared by Professor George Counts and others, the Commission on the Social Studies of the American Historical Association said as follows: "The Commission is convinced that the actually integrated economy of the present day is the forerunner of a consciously integrated society in which individual economic actions and individual property rights will be altered and abridged." Indeed, in an educational magazine called The Social Frontier, we read as follows: "Is economic regimentation really evil? It all depends on who does the regimenting and the purpose the process is intended to serve. If regimentation is the consequence of the human urges of the millions who seek a life of work, dignity, security, and material and cultural plenty, it is humanizing and consequently good. Such regimentation is no regimentation at all. It is rather humanization, liberalization, and socialization." There, as you can see, the educators tell us that there's nothing necessarily wrong with regimentation. They tell us, no, regimentation's perfectly all right, as long as they, the educators, are the ones who are doing the regimenting. If they're doing the regimenting, they tell us, then regimentation is perfectly all right. Now, how was all this to be achieved? What were some of the methods that these totalitarian educators were planning to use in order to reach these goals? William Hurd Kilpatrick tells us, he says, for example, "As we look forward to certain necessary changes in our institutional forms, it is of course possible that some violent revolution may be the actual means by which such changes are effected. If the beneficiaries of entrenched injustice are so misguided as to force it, they may bring on such a violent revolution. In other words, says Kilpatrick, if you refuse to give up your property rights, then, he says, the educators will feel perfectly justified in fomenting a violent revolution to take your property rights away. Now remember, ladies and gentlemen, once again, that the people we're talking about here are not just some silly headbusters out in the street in some riot. These are the top names in American education. Once again, this is William Hurd Kilpatrick I'm quoting from to you. In 1937, for example, the National Education Association told us this: the present capitalistic and nationalistic social system has been supplanted in but one place, Russia, and that change was effected by revolution. Hence, the verdict of history would seem to indicate that we are likely to have to depend upon revolution for social change of an important and far-reaching character. Once again, I'm reading to you now, as you can hear, not from the statements of the revolutionaries on the bottom in the streets. I'm reading now from the establishment. These are the people at the very top, at the pinnacle of what is often called the establishment in our country. Now, suppose the people of America object to all this. Suppose you don't want to give up your property rights. What happens then? William Hurd Kilpatrick, as usual, has the answer. In the new society, he tells us, men shall no longer be compelled to work against each other, but may rather be permitted and encouraged, and, if a recalcitrant minority requires it, be compelled to cooperate for the common good. In other words, you will behave the way Kilpatrick wants you to behave, and if you refuse to behave that way, you will be compelled to behave the way Kilpatrick wants you to behave. The report of the Commission on the Social Studies, from which I quoted a moment ago, says as follows: almost certainly, it will involve a larger measure of compulsory as well as voluntary cooperation of citizens in the conduct of the complex national economy. Indeed, says Dr. Norman Wilful in a magazine called Progressive Education, if we wish the intelligent utilization of the marvelous natural resources and the superb productive machinery which America possesses, we must not blindly shrink from the fact that it may require some use of force against those at present privileged. They feel perfectly justified, as you can see, in using force to take your property rights away. Now, what would all this do to our freedom of speech? What would this type of thing do to the constitutional guarantees that the Founding Fathers provided for us? What would this do to our Bill of Rights? An educator by the name of Harry Elmer Barnes has the answer. In a magazine published by the Progressive Education Association called Frontiers of Democracy, Professor Barnes says this: friends of planned social change might as well be prepared for the regimentation of economic life and the restriction of complete intellectual freedom, which effective planning must entail. We cannot have social planning without paying a price, therefore, in terms of some curtailment of pioneer individualism and freedom. These, of course, are the same people who every day use the term academic freedom, isn't that right? These are the people who can barely get through a paragraph of connected sentences without using the phrase academic freedom. As you can see here, however, what they really mean by the phrase academic freedom is their ability, their right to spread the propaganda throughout the United States with which they hope they're going to destroy us. They don't want academic freedom for the people in general, for you and me. They want academic freedom for themselves, which they hope to use to destroy us. And of course, ladies and gentlemen, you apparently have had a very good example of this so-called academic freedom right here in your own town, which, of course, is why we're meeting right here tonight in the fire department. In fact, says an educator named Dr. Norman Wilful, it may be necessary, paradoxically enough, for us to control our press as the Russian press is controlled and as the Nazi press was controlled. Democratic objectives are open, intelligent, creative. They are pointed at the welfare of every individual and at the realization of a great common culture. Surely we could have nothing to fear from a press controlled to reflect, realize, and glorify such objectives. Here, as you can see, they actually tell us in black and white that it would be perfectly all right for us to have a press controlled as Goebbels controlled the Nazi press for Adolf Hitler. That, they tell us, is perfectly all right as long as they, the educators, are the ones who are doing the controlling. If they're running the press, then it would be perfectly all right, they say, for us to have a press controlled as the Nazi press was controlled by Adolf Hitler. I realize, ladies and gentlemen, in passing, that if you're hearing some of these statements for the very first time, you're shocked, you're shattered, you're dumbfounded, you're incredulous. You find it difficult to believe that these educators could possibly have been so blatant, so open about the schemes, about the tactics that they were planning on using on you. And I wish that there was some way I could tone these statements down to make them a little more believable for you. But if I did that, I would be misquoting them. As you can see, I'm just reading to you from their various meetings, conferences, magazines, articles, books, publications. I strongly urge you to go to your libraries as soon as you can and to check these statements out. The place that these educators planned to work was, of course, through the schools. Professor Harold Rugg, for example, tells us, "Thus, through the schools of the world, we shall disseminate a new conception of government, one that will embrace all of the collective activities of men, that will postulate the need for scientific control and operation of economic activities in the interests of all the people. And since they are working for totalitarian dictatorship, one of the things that these totalitarian educators have been planning to do from the very beginning is to destroy the individual, to make it impossible for an individual to graduate from these schools that they are running. All dictators, of course, are very hostile toward and terrified about the idea of the individual, because, of course, it is strong, resolute, self-reliant, independent individuals who finally decide that a dictator has to be removed. It is such individuals who finally decide to get together and overthrow dictators. And for that reason, all dictators are very hostile about the idea of the individual. Professor John Dewey, for example, wrote with approval of what he called the ability and the desire to think collectively. Dewey said, "The idea of perfecting an inner personality is a sure sign of social divisions. What is called inner is simply that which does not connect with others, which is not capable of free and full communication. What is termed spiritual culture has usually been futile, with something rotten about it, just because it has been conceived as a thing which a man might have internally and therefore exclusively. What one is as a person is what one is as associated with others, in a free give and take of intercourse." Notice there, ladies and gentlemen, the incredible, vitriolic hatred that Dewey expresses there toward privacy. All dictators, of course, are very terrified about, hostile toward the idea of privacy, because it is in the privacy of one's mind that an individual thinks thoughts to oppose a dictator. It is in private that individuals finally decide to get together and overthrow dictators. And for that reason, all dictators are also very hostile toward the idea of privacy. And here, as you can see, Dewey expresses an implacable, vitriolic hatred toward the idea of privacy. In and of yourself, he says, as you have just heard, you're nothing. You are only what you are insofar as you are related to somebody else, he tells you. In and of yourself, you're nothing. What's going on in the privacy of your mind, he tells you, your spiritual culture, he says, is rotten. I presume he was speaking for himself. All such people believe that man is not a spiritual creature, but simply a collection of random molecules and atoms. And of course, this is why Dewey was completely opposed to the possibility of any spiritual life for man. Indeed, says William Hurd Kilpatrick, on the social side, the theory of education should show how the individual alone is but an abstraction, impossible either to be or be conceived except partially. So Dewey says that the individual is rotten. Kilpatrick, as you can see, says that there's no such thing. And the technique that these totalitarian educators began to use from the very beginning to destroy the individual and to destroy privacy is, of course, the same technique that experimental psychologists use on rats. They call it, of course, conditioning. In 1932, the National Education Association said as follows, "Conditioning is therefore a process which may be employed by the teacher to build up attitudes in the child and predispose him to the actions by which these attitudes are expressed." Conditioning, says the NEA, is a perfectly acceptable technique for the teacher in these government schools, these public schools, to use on the innocent kids in those schools. As Professor George Counts once put it, if progressive education is to be genuinely progressive, it must become somewhat less frightened than it is today at the bogies of imposition and indoctrination. So Counts says here, as you can see, that it's perfectly all right for the teacher to use the technique of indoctrination in order to develop the kind of person that these totalitarians want to graduate from these government schools. That technique naturally includes a change in curriculum, a change in what is actually being taught in these schools. So Willard E. Givens, who, as you will recall, recommended the nationalization of everything in our country and later became the executive director of the NEA, Willard E. Givens speaks with approval of what he calls a great program of studies for the schools of the new America. One central core of that program will be a new social science, which will be built directly from the factors and problems of our contemporary society. In fact, once again, according to Professor George Counts, that the teachers should deliberately reach for power and then make the most of their conquest is my firm conviction. To the extent that they are permitted to fashion the curriculum and procedures of the school, they will definitely and positively influence the social attitudes, ideals, and behavior of the coming generation. So if the teacher just goes to school and tries to teach the kids how to read, write, add up a column of figures, that's no good, says Counts. The teachers should go to school and should deliberately reach for power, he says. And then he says they should make the most of their conquest. They should use that power to reshape the curriculum so as to influence the social attitudes, ideals, and behavior of the next generation. Now, what specifically, according to the plan, were these totalitarians planning to teach the children in these government schools? Well, for instance, in a document called Education for International Understanding in American Schools, the National Education Association said as follows soon after the Second World War. They said, "Many persons believe that enduring peace cannot be achieved so long as the nation-state system continues as at present constituted. Enduring peace cannot be attained until the nation-states surrender to a world organization the exercise of jurisdiction over those problems with which they have found themselves unable to deal singly in the past." So the goal, as you have just heard, isn't just to impose a totalitarian socialist dictatorship on the people of the United States. The goal is to impose a world socialist totalitarian dictatorship on all the people of the world, in which the people of the United States, our government, our country, would be submerged. And therefore, says the National Education Association, the school program must include experiences designed to tap all the sources that go into producing the desired behavior characteristic of the world-minded American. Actual change in behavior is the goal, and any modification in behavior entails changes in attitudes. They're trying to change behavior, mold attitudes. That is what the teachers are ordered to do, instructed to do by such top educators at the top of the pyramid as Professor George Counts himself. It is interesting, by the way, ladies and gentlemen, to note that in this document, Education for International Understanding in American Schools, the National Education Association recommends 2 books for use on the children in these government schools. One is a Russian textbook called New Russia's Primer. The other is a book with the intriguing title, I Want to Be Like Stalin. I Want to Be Like Stalin. The National Education Association apparently believes that this is appropriate reading material for the students in the government schools, in the public schools across the United States. At about the same time, UNESCO, the United Nations Educational, Scientific, and Cultural Organization, an agency of the United Nations to which the conspirators are trying to surrender our country, UNESCO published a series of pamphlets which they entitled Toward World Understanding. In that series, UNESCO said this: UNESCO is working to assist countries to examine their own textbooks and teaching materials with a view to improving them as aids to international understanding. A model plan for the analysis of textbooks has been drafted. After it has been checked by experts in different countries, UNESCO will suggest to its member states that they review their own textbooks in the light of the recommendations. The importance of including information, where appropriate, on the United Nations and its specialized agencies is stressed. So the plan, as you have just heard, is to have UNESCO draw up a list of guidelines for the crucially important textbooks in the schools. Then those guidelines will be forwarded to the different school systems. And then the crucially important textbooks will be reworked, rewritten, replaced so as to make the new textbooks conform to these guidelines that UNESCO has sent to the schools. And as you have just heard, UNESCO says it's crucially important that in the new textbooks that they are planning on slipping over on us, favorable mention of the United Nations be included. Why? Because, of course, the more favorably the students in the government schools, the public schools across the country, the more favorably they can be brought to think of the United Nations, well, the easier it will be for the revolutionaries at the top of our society to slip our country into this world totalitarian socialist dictatorship, which is their goal. The easier it will be for them to convince these students who graduate from these schools to surrender our sovereignty, to surrender our national independence, because, of course, they will have for years been reading in their textbooks about how wonderful the world organization called the United Nations is. Now, what's the biggest single obstacle to all this? What's the biggest single roadblock lying in the path of these totalitarian educators as they march to what they hope will be their totalitarian dictatorship? Well, of course, it's the institution of the family. It's the family which produces the child and then sends the child off to these government schools. And for that reason, of course, these totalitarians have complained bitterly, vitriolically, from the very beginning about the institution of the family. For instance, Professor William Hurd Kilpatrick tells us, many parents form their ideas about school by having gone to school a generation ago. They are afraid of anything different. Many of these parents have a very inadequate social outlook, especially when you come to human relations and group relations. Many parents, otherwise excellent, have very inadequate group attitudes, and so teach their children in advance wrong ways to think and feel. The problem, says Kilpatrick, as you can see, is that you have inadequate group attitudes, whatever that may mean. You probably didn't know that before you came up here this evening. You see how lucky you are that you showed up? That's the problem. You have inadequate group attitudes. As UNESCO put it in Toward World Understanding, as long as the child breathes the poisoned air of nationalism, education in world-mindedness can produce only rather precarious results. As we have pointed out, it is frequently the family that infects the child with extreme nationalism. The school should therefore combat family attitudes that favor jingoism. That's the problem. And that problem will be solved not only by working on the kids. Parents, says UNESCO, will be brought by talks with the teacher to admit, in theory, that their narrow family spirit threatens the integration of their child in the school. So the scheme includes bringing mom to school. You see, mom will be brought to school. And there she will be sat down and she will be given a lecture by the teacher. The teacher will previously have been told how to deliver this lecture by the people at the very top of the educational pyramid. And the teacher will explain to mom that the real problem, you see, is her narrow family spirit. Her narrow family spirit, that's what's threatening the integration of her child in the school. That's what UNESCO says is the plan that the revolutionaries are going to use in order to slip this totalitarian dictatorship over on us. As the National Education Association once put it, agencies such as the school must assume responsibilities which in the past have rested upon the home and the community. And finally, ladies and gentlemen, perhaps the most favorite of all the techniques that these totalitarian educators use is, of course, the technique of secrecy. And the reason that that is their favorite of all techniques is that, once again, what we're talking about here this evening is a conspiracy. And one of the things, according to the dictionary, that a conspiracy has to have in order to be a conspiracy is secrecy. In order to be a conspiracy, the members of that conspiracy have to operate in secret. And for that reason, once again, this is one of their favorite techniques. For instance, in a magazine called Progressive Education in February 1951, we read as follows: "Our teacher will have to choose whether to try to live up to the principles which he morally can accept and risk being discharged, or whether to temporize with the situation, abiding actually or ostensibly by the decision of those in control, but here and there secretively failing to abide by the injunction, and not stating his position too openly in the wrong places. It seems to me that the individual teacher will have to make up his mind in terms of the alternatives before him, to wit, how well he can make an adjustment if discharged, how likely he is to get caught. Ultimately, force may often best be met with force and with its accompanying deceit. There, as you just heard, the teachers are told that it's perfectly all right for them to use trickery, deception, cunning, deceit, in order slyly, gradually, to slip this totalitarian dictatorship over on the heads of the innocent students in these government schools here in the United States. Well, now, ladies and gentlemen, now that we've taken a fairly brief look at the background of the unbelievable problems in American schools today, let's now, as I suggested, move ahead and take a look at some of the things specifically happening, actually happening, in one school after another across our country. And let's take a look at some of these things against the background of this ideological and historical summary that I've just presented to you. For instance, one of the things that so many people are worried about in our country today is the turmoil in the schools. The turmoil now sweeping across so many of our college campuses, now sweeping, unbelievable though it may be, through many of our high schools, and now sweeping, unbelievable though it is, even through a few junior high schools. What is the source of so much of this turmoil that you're all so worried about? Where does the source of this turmoil lie? Here, ladies and gentlemen, is a very fascinating document. As I'm sure you all can see, it's a magazine. It's a magazine called Today's Education. Today's Education, of course, is the official journal of the National Education Association. Every teacher who belongs to the National Education Association gets a copy of Today's Education once a month. In other words, 1 million or so copies of this are printed every month, and 1 million or so teachers get a copy of this once a month. This is a fairly recent issue. It's the issue of September 1970. Let's look inside this issue of Today's Education for the answer to our question of what the source of so much of this turmoil in our schools actually is. And let's turn first to an article called "We Must Be Reasoning Activists." We must be reasoning activists. The author of the article is a lady named Helen Bain. Mrs. Bain, until not long ago, of course, was the president of the National Education Association. In her article, we read as follows: "An organization of the size and potential influence of the NEA has a responsibility to the nation as a whole for promoting social change. To fulfill this expectation, it is imperative that every local association establish a human relations committee through which teachers will join with other groups such as the NAACP, National Urban League, B'nai B'rith, the National Congress of American Indians, and national organizations representing Spanish-speaking Americans to help solve the social problems within their community. I am convinced that no other group of citizens has the opportunity, the influence, or the multiple skills we educators have for producing this needed social change." Now, of course, ladies and gentlemen, you don't send your kids to these schools to produce social change. You send them so that somebody can teach them how to read, write, add up a column of figures. Mrs. Bain, however, says that what she's doing in the schools is she is working to produce needed social change. Now, who said it was needed social change? You didn't. She says it's needed social change. This is what she says she is asking, cajoling her teachers, her members of her organization to do in the schools, using your children in these schools as the guinea pigs. Let's turn now to the very next article in this same issue of Today's Education. The very next article is called "Strategies for a Real Academic Revolution." Strategies for a Real Academic Revolution. The author of this article, it says here, is a gentleman by the name of Wallace B. Graves. Who is Mr. Graves? He is the president of the University of Evansville in Evansville, Indiana. This article is adapted, it says here, from a speech that Mr. Graves gave to the freshman class of his own university. What does Mr. Graves tell the freshman class of his own university? He says, "If, as the course proceeds, you find the professor the captive of his textbook or hypnotized by his lecture notes, get him off the subject. This, of course, is a threadbare student strategy, as old as the hills. The secret of my revolutionary system is to distract the professor with questions about the subject that genuinely intrigue and confound you. Is the professor enthralled by his lectures, and does he revel in the drama and interpretive nuances of each point he makes? Arrange with other members of the class to applaud the professor after each performance, and from time to time to call out, 'Encore! Encore!' Perhaps the professor is shy, or rather too formal to join the company of students as a fellow learner. Then ask a couple of football players to come to class 5 minutes early to carry out his desk or podium. Offer to take over the class one day. Do you still wonder what the source of the turmoil is? What are you wondering about? Here it is right here, in the official journal of the National Education Association. Still another of the innumerable available proofs showing that the source of the turmoil in the schools isn't the college students, it isn't the high school students, it certainly isn't the junior high school students, it certainly isn't the elementary school students, for Pete's sake. They don't dream these things up. The source of it is the people at the very top of the educational pyramid. Here's the president of the university, the president. He's talking to the freshman class. In other words, teenagers, 16, 17, 18 years old. He's telling them, interrupt the class, disrupt the class, scream out in class. He tells them, come to class early, carry out the professor's desk. Then he says, finally, just take the class over. What are you wondering about? Here's the source of it right here, in the official journal of the National Education Association. That's the source of the turmoil that you see in school after school across the country. Now, another thing you will remember that these totalitarian conspiratorial educationists said they were going to do was to change the curriculum in the schools. They said, as you will remember, that they were going to change what was being taught in the schools. And since that was what they said, let's now take a look at some of these changes in curriculum that they have made. For instance, ladies and gentlemen, suppose you wanted to destroy a country. Suppose you wanted to devise a technique you could use to destroy a country. What could you do? Well, one of the best things that you could do if you wanted to destroy a country would be to figure out some way of preventing the people growing up in that country from learning how to read. If you could just do that one thing, if you could just figure out a way to prevent the children growing up in that country from learning how to read, you would, just by doing that, have destroyed the country. But suppose you wanted not just to destroy the country, but to enslave it. Suppose you wanted to capture the country and enslave the people under a dictatorship. What would you have to do then? Then you would have to teach them to read, because you would have to teach them to read enough so that they could read your propaganda. Every dictator needs propaganda. Nero needed it. He called his propaganda bread and circuses. Hitler had Goebbels. Every dictator needs propaganda to keep the people he is controlling under control. So you would have to teach the people you're controlling how to read enough to read your propaganda. But you wouldn't want to teach them to read too well. If you taught them to read too well, they might do research to expose you. They might finally, if they finally realized that you were enslaving them under a dictatorship, they might begin to write things which other people would read, which might finally lead to your overthrow as a dictator in that country. Against that brief background, let's now take a look at the two ways reading has been taught in our country. In the traditional way reading has been taught, the teacher draws the letters of the alphabet. She writes the letters of the alphabet on the blackboard. She says to the child, English is a language which has an alphabet. That alphabet is composed of 26 letters. Here they are on the blackboard. Memorize those 26 letters. Now suppose you teach reading in that way. What have you got? Once the child learns those letters, he's no longer under your control, because he's got the basic tools, he's got the basic equipment. Once he's got those 26 letters, you can't control them anymore. When he grows up with those 26 tools, he later on will be able to go into libraries, he'll be able to use a dictionary, he'll be able to do research, he'll be able to write things to oppose you if he finds out that you're enslaving him. Now, on the contrary, let's take a look at how reading has been taught in our country for the last 40 years. Let's, in other words, take a look at the look-say system. How does that system of reading work? In that system, the teacher draws a word on the board. She draws the word dog on the board. Now, you and I know that she has written the word dog on the board, that she's written the letters, D-O-G, on the board. But the child, your child, doesn't know that because nobody's told him yet that there's an alphabet, right? He isn't born with this knowledge. Somebody has to tell it to him. All he sees is the teacher drawing a shape on the board. She doesn't say there's an alphabet. What she says is, here's what she's told to say. She says, whenever you see this exact shape on that board, you'll know that's the word dog. Now, what have you got if you teach somebody to read in that manner? Then you have a mentality, you have a consciousness that is under your control. Why? Because such a person does not have the basic equipment. He doesn't have the basic 26 tools. He can't do research. He can't go into a library and use a dictionary. Many of these unfortunates who've been taught to read in this fashion can't really read. As I'm sure you know, you've all met these unfortunates who can't really read because they've been taught to read in this fashion. Such a person only knows what you want him to know because he has no way of finding anything out for himself. He only knows what somebody else tells him. A couple of teachers of reading, for example, in their reading manual say as follows. They write, "Little is gained by teaching the child his sounds and letters as a first step to reading. More rapid results are generally obtained by the direct method of simply showing the word to the child and telling him what it says." Another teacher of reading says, "The simplest solution when a child does not know a word is to tell him what it says." So such a consciousness, such a person taught to read in this fashion gets used to having somebody tell him what something says, you see? He gets into that mental habit from earliest childhood. I don't have to find out what it means. Teacher will be there or somebody else will be there. She'll tell me what it means. Such a person will always be under somebody else's control. He will never have an independent mind. He will never really be able to read. His knowledge of the language will always be vague, fuzzy, haphazard. He'll always be somebody who has to guess at what the words on the printed page mean. And this, once again, is the way reading has been taught in our country for the last 40 years. Now, I know, ladies and gentlemen, that you have been told recently that this system has been changed to some extent and that phonics has been reintroduced. In other words, the alphabet has been reintroduced into the educational system. What really is happening is this, though, because so many people have been complaining in America about this look-say system that I've been describing for you, what the educators have done now is they've introduced a little phonics, you see, but the system basically is still look-say. They've introduced a little phonics so that when you come to complain, they can say, "But we do teach phonics." Isn't that the phrase? I'm sure some of you have heard this phrase. "But we do teach phonics. 3 years ago, we taught it for 15 minutes. See, just to give you the impression that they really have gone back to the traditional, sensible way of teaching somebody how to read. Basically, you still have this same system across the country, which has now been interspersed with a little bit of phonics, a little bit of alphabet, in order to keep you satisfied. Now, you'll remember also, ladies and gentlemen, that another one of the plans that these conspiratorial totalitarian educators had was to introduce into the system, as part of their new curriculum, what Willard E. Givens called a new science of social studies. That's what he called it, a new science of social studies. Since that was what he said, let's now take a quick look at some of the things that are now going on in the social studies courses in school after school across the United States. Let's, for example, take a look at this piece of social studies. This is a typical social studies textbook. We only have time, ladies and gentlemen, for me to show you a few examples this evening, of course. Here's one of them. This book is called Philosophy for a New Generation. The publisher of Philosophy for a New Generation is the Macmillan Company, which, of course, is one of the biggest, best-known publishers in the world. Let's take a look inside Philosophy for a New Generation and find out what the students are required to read. This is required reading in the social studies courses. I got this one from a student at Miami-Dade Junior College in Florida, of course. Let's first take a look at the dedicatory page of Philosophy for a New Generation. For Arthur K. Bierman, whose successful fight against the House Un-American Activities Committee was an inspiration for the old and new generations alike. Now let's take a look. Strictly non-political, you see. We want to keep this non-political, you know. That's why we had to come to the firehouse, you see, because we're so political. Let's take a look now at the table of contents of Philosophy for a New Generation. We don't have to spend any more time on it than that. First, the students are required to read the founding statement of Students for a Democratic Society. The founding statement of that communist terrorist organization is required reading. Then the students have to read Black Panther Rules. The rules of that communist terrorist organization are also required reading. Then the students have to read an article called Colonialism by a gentleman named Frantz Fanon. Frantz Fanon, of course, was the ideological leader of the communist takeover of Algeria in 1962. Then there's an article called Philosophy and Ideology for Decolonization by a gentleman named Kwame Nkrumah, former communist dictator of Ghana, who, as you will remember, was kicked out by the Ghanaian people a few years ago when they had finally had enough of his communist dictatorship. Then there's an article called The New Man by the most famous of all Western Hemisphere liberals, Mr. Ernesto Che Guevara himself. Then there's an article called Liberty. The author of that one is Harold J. Lasky. Lasky, of course, was one of the key leaders of the Fabian Socialist Society, which I mentioned at the beginning of my talk. Then there's an article called Justice Through Revolution. Justice Through Revolution, interesting title. The author of that one is Reinhold Niebuhr, who, of course, at one time advocated the violent seizure of the American government. Then there's an article called Estranged Labor by Mr. Karl Marx himself, followed by an article with another intriguing title, Technology and the Control of Man's Freedom. Technology and the Control of Man's Freedom. The author of that one is Mr. Herbert Marcus, guide, protector, defender of communist terrorist Angela Davis, now awaiting trial in California, charged, as you know, with participating in the murder of those 4 people at the courthouse in Southern California last year. Now suppose, ladies and gentlemen, suppose I say to you, who won the Second World War? Who won the Second World War? Your answer, of course, is, well, that's a pretty stupid question. We won the Second World War. What kind of a stupid question is that? No, Mom, no. We didn't win the Second World War. You're wrong there too, Mom. Here's another very fascinating textbook. This one's called The World's History. The publisher of this one is Harcourt, Brace and Company, another one of the biggest, best-known publishers in the world. Let's look inside this textbook for the answer to our question of who won the Second World War. And let's turn first to page 667. On page 667, there's a section 5 in big black letters headed, The United Nations Take the Offensive. The end of 1942 was, as Churchill said, the end of the beginning for the United Nations. Their superior resources were beginning to show in shiploads of men, planes, and tanks moving out to the far-flung battlefronts. Before the end of 1942, in both Europe and the Pacific, the United Nations took the offensive. Then there's a little subheading, United Nations Plans. The overall military plan of the United Nations called for concentrating on the defeat of Germany first, then striking hard at Japan. Until Germany was defeated, Japan was to be pushed back in the Pacific with whatever resources the United Nations could spare. You see, Mom, how mixed up you are? We didn't win the Second World War. The UN won it. That's got to be true. It says so right here in your daughter's high school textbook. Got to be true. All I read to you was this little section that I've circled with a fountain pen. This goes on for page after page after page. I can't read it all to you. All I read was that little section. UN mentioned more than half a dozen times just in that little section. You see, Mom? We didn't win the Second World War. You see how little you know? UN won the Second World War. But wait a minute now. Some of you may be thinking now, okay, you read to us from one book. It says the UN won the Second World War. Maybe this is just an incredible blooper of some sort, an incredible exception. Maybe you're misleading us, Stang. Maybe if you read another textbook, it would say something else. Why don't you read another textbook? Okay, I just happen to have another textbook with me, completely by accident, of course, completely spontaneous. This one is called A Survey of European Civilization. A Survey of European Civilization. The publisher of this one is Houghton, Mifflin and Company, another one of the biggest, best-known publishers in the world. Let's see who they say won the Second World War. Let's turn first to page 872. Page 872. In 6 years of war, 1939 to 1945, the United Nations destroyed some 700 U-boats. You have to admire an outfit like that. It hasn't even been organized. Already they destroyed some 700 U-boats. Can you imagine what they're going to do once they get organized? The UN, of course, was formed at the end of the war in the summer of 1945. Here we're told during the war they already destroyed 700 U-boats. Next page. Their hope of peace. And please imagine that you are hearing, while I'm reading this, imagine that behind my voice you're hearing that female chorus. You know that female chorus? La 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 lam, you know? Imagine you hearing that. Their hope of peace was lifted by the development of the United Nations as a wartime coalition. It was little more than an idea when the name was formally adopted on January 1st, 1942. But under the leadership of the Big Three, it grew steadily in solidarity and strength. As signs of German exhaustion increased, the attacks were doubled and redoubled, for war is as much a battle of morale as of military force. Propaganda leaflets and daily radio broadcasts informed the peoples of Europe of the victorious progress of the United Nations. Next page. All German territory was immediately divided into occupation zones, and the United Nations announced that victory in Europe had been achieved. I read about a dozen of these textbooks, ladies and gentlemen, to prepare for this talk, just to make sure that I wasn't misleading myself, that I wasn't getting off on a wrong track. Every book I read says the same thing. Now, there may be other books that say something else. I'm perfectly ready to admit that. But the 12 books that I picked up at random and looked into all said exactly the same thing. They all said that the UN had won the Second World War. Almost as if the professors had sat down around a table somewhere in some smoke-filled back room and said, here's the way we're going to treat the issue of the Second World War. Now, do you remember what the plan was? I read you the plan from the UNESCO series called Toward World Understanding. Do you remember what the plan was? They said we're going to prepare a model plan for textbooks. Then they said we're going to revise those textbooks and make them conform to this plan. And you will remember that they said one of the things that the new textbooks must include is favorable mention of the UN. Because they said they felt the more favorably they can get the students to think of the United Nations, the easier it will be for them to get these students, to con these students, when they're adults, into surrendering the sovereignty that some of you in the audience had to fight for to protect in this Second World War, which of course the United States of America won. Now you'll remember also that another one of the plans that they had, another one of the things that they were complaining about, was of course the idea of the individual. You'll remember my showing you how hostile Dewey was, how hostile Kilpatrick was to the idea of the individual, to the idea of privacy, because these are things, of course, that all dictators are very terrified about, because it is individuals who in private decide to overthrow dictatorships. And for that reason, these totalitarian conspirators in the schools have devised various schemes to destroy the individual and to destroy the idea of privacy. One of the techniques they have been developed to do that is the technique in which they give the students all sorts of tests, all sorts of questionnaires, day after day after day in the schools, the purpose of which is to get inside the child's mind and find out what's going on in there. To give you a couple of examples of what I'm talking about now, here are a couple of typical questionnaires handed out to the kids in a government school in the United States. These were given to, well, one of them was given to an elementary school student and the other to a junior high school student. These are what is called phrase completion tests. There are various types. These happen to be phrase completion. The student is given a phrase and he's asked to complete that phrase with the first thing that comes into his mind. This is going on all over the country. Here are some of the phrases that the student is asked to complete. Today I feel. I get angry when. I wish my parents knew. I feel bad when. I'm afraid. Most brothers and sisters. I often worry about. I like. I wish. I'm afraid of. I. At night. I hate. God. In other words, the time in the school is taken up, instead of teaching the child what he needs to know, what they don't know, unfortunately, today, the time is taken up in the class where the teacher has been ordered to give the child such tests as these. And this is not an exception, ladies and gentlemen. This goes on day after day after day in the schools. One questionnaire after another is presented to the child, the purpose of which is to break inside his mind, get inside his mind, find out what's going on in there so as to destroy his privacy. Indeed, Some of you, I'm sure, 2 or 3 of you, will remember a little more than a year ago when a psychiatrist named Dr. Arnold Hutschnecker, very close friend of President Nixon's, Dr. Arnold Hutschnecker proposed that all 6 to 8-year-old kids in the United States be given compulsory psychological tests. I'm sure 2 or 3 of you remember reading about that a little more than a year ago when Dr. Hutschnecker made that proposal. There was a big uproar at the time. He wants to give every 6-year-old kid in the country compulsory psychological tests. That means, of course, whether you like it or not. Dr. Hutschnecker says, there are Pavlovian methods which I have seen effectively used in the Soviet Union. President Nixon's great friend takes as his inspiration the Pavlovian methods, the conditioning methods that the communists use on the kids in the schools in communist Russia. These are methods which Dr. Hutschnecker apparently feels are appropriate for use in the schools here in the United States. Here, ladies and gentlemen, is another one of these techniques that these totalitarian conspirators who control the schools put over on you and your kids in these schools. This is an educational manual prepared by the people at the very top of the school systems. This is called Methods in Human Development, Theory Manual, 1970 revision. Let's take a look inside this scheme, see what this scheme is all about. And let's turn first to page 46, because on page 46 we'll find out what the problem is. What's the problem? On page 46 we read, around the first grade, or about age 6, children begin to close to themselves and to others, to bury or mask their feelings and thoughts, subtly and usually unconsciously distorting their expressions and their actions. Nobody can bear to feel unlikable and unacceptable, and so all sorts of tiny iron curtains start falling into place, partitioning the child's experience and his sense of himself. By the time the child is 10 years old, he is no longer whole. He is defensive, withdrawn, cagey, self-segregating. He is, in fact, neurotic. In other words, we're told here, if somebody is born, lives at home for 6 years, goes to school for 4 more years, reaches the age of 10, just by virtue of the fact that he's lived to be 10 years old, he is, by that fact, neurotic. That's what we're told here. He has got to be cured by the educators who have prepared this manual. Okay, what's the solution? The solution is a technique that the inventors of it in this manual call magic circle. Magic circle. Now, magic circle, I've found in my travels, has different names in different parts of the country. Somewhere, in some places, it's called show and tell. That's what it's called here, huh? In other places, it's called sharing time. It has different names. It's really basically the same idea. In the manual here, the inventors of it call it magic circle. Now, what's magic circle? Every morning, the teacher says to the kids, sit around in a circle. Kids sit around in a circle. Teacher says, talk about yourselves. Talk about yourselves. So for a period of time every morning, the kids talk about themselves. Now, what is the purpose of this scheme? What is the purpose of having the kids sit around and talk about themselves? Well, the inventors of it tell us. They say on page 20, they say, the leader maintains as his principal motive the opening up of each and every child so that he may have the opportunity to express himself as fully and as honestly as is possible. In other words, what they're trying to do is get inside the child's mind, find out what's going on in the privacy of his own mind, find out what his private thoughts are, destroy his privacy, get him used to thinking in non-private terms, because every day he has a little session like this. Now, what's the effect of a scheme like this going to be? On page 34, the inventors tell us. They say, perceptive teachers and administrators often ask a potentially embarrassing question. If we do encourage the open expression of feelings, and the Human Development Program does do all it says it can, won't this lead the children to challenge much of what goes on in the schools? The honest and true answer is, yes, it will. Still another demonstration, ladies and gentlemen, of the fact that the source of all this turmoil in the schools isn't really these elementary school students. It's the people at the very top of the educational pyramid who dream these schemes up. Here you have another proof of that. They tell you that if you put a system like this, a scheme like this into the school, the result of it will be that the students will begin challenging what goes on in the schools. Another demonstration of where the source of this turmoil and unrest in the school lies. Now, What's the role of the teacher in all this? How does the teacher fit into all this? Well, the authors of the scheme tell us as follows. They say, there are a few teachers who will coldly say that their job is to get through the syllabus, cover X through Y in a certain time, keep the children in line, move them along to the next grade with a minimum of disturbances and failures, and start again on the next batch. This is indeed a narrow and archaic view, better suited to an assembly line worker in a factory, and the harm done by such teachers is inexcusable. Nevertheless, we may in calmer moments feel genuinely sorry for them, because they are, of course, unhappy, misplaced men and women. In other words, if the teacher goes to school every day conscientiously, does whatever she can in the most trying of circumstances to try to teach these kids to read, write, add up a column of figures, if that's what she does, she is a misplaced, unhappy woman. We should feel sorry for her. She is better suited to work in a factory on an assembly line. And this, by the way, ladies and gentlemen, is the right place for me to underline something, for me to underline it 3 times, something crucially important, which is this. Here you have a perfect demonstration of the fact that it isn't the teachers who are responsible for these schemes. Please don't get the idea that I am blaming, or that you should go away blaming the teachers for these problems in the schools. The teachers don't think these schemes up. They're too busy in class teaching. These schemes are thought up by the people at the very top of the educational pyramid. Then they go down to the state boards of education. They go down to the district superintendents. They go down to the principals, to the chairman of departments, and then down to the teachers at the very bottom. The teachers are forced to use these schemes. Please don't get the idea that I'm blaming the teachers or that you should blame the teachers. The teachers are being victimized by these totalitarians just as much as the kids are. Now, I know the tendency is when your kid first comes home and reveals one of these things that I'm describing to you, your first tendency is to go and complain about the teacher, to the teacher at least, because it's the teacher who's doing it. But remember, ladies and gentlemen, you have to be a little sympathetic. The teachers aren't ordered to do this. This is their job. If they don't want to do it, they're out. So don't get the idea that I'm asking you to go and criticize the teachers because of these schemes. As a matter of fact, the authors of the scheme also tell us this. What the Human Development Program does on a few occasions is to bring a teacher into contact with her own feelings of inadequacy. When some teachers are asked to extend their classroom competence beyond the multiplication table or sentence structure, they suddenly find themselves feeling limited as just plain people. In other words, the teacher too is expected to reveal her private thoughts in this magic circle. If the teacher, unfortunately, happens to have feelings of inadequacy, she is expected to reveal these feelings in public, in class, before the students in her class. What business is it of anybody else's what the teacher's private feelings may happen to be? What business is it of anybody else's if she happens to have, unfortunately, feelings of inadequacy? That's nobody else's business. That's her private business. Here we're told that the teacher, too, has to participate in this magic circle scheme. She has to reveal what's going on in her mind. If she has feelings of inadequacy, she has to reveal them in public. Along these lines, ladies and gentlemen, one of the things that we hear about on television these days is the invasion of privacy. Isn't that right? J. Edgar Hoover tapped the phone of somebody suspected to be a communist. He's trying to protect the country. This is an invasion of privacy. It's terrible. Why don't they complain about this, these defenders of our privacy? This is the most incredible invasion of privacy in history. Why don't you hear them up in arms about this? They never mention it. They complain about J. Edgar Hoover. He tapped some communist telephone. And finally, in this same manual, here's what the teacher reads. She reads, this is the teacher's manual, during the remaining time of today's session, the teacher encourages a general discussion centered around any negative behaviors that the children may report about themselves or that they have observed in other people. Now, what's a negative behavior? In this volume, we learn that a negative behavior is anything the child does that conflicts with the group. See, the child is taught to get security, confidence, by being in a group. And when he does something that conflicts with the group, that's a negative behavior. And the child immediately has to report this nasty negative behavior that he committed to the group so that he can be taken back into the group and forgiven. You see, that's where he gets his feeling of security. To make the child dependent upon the group, to make him get his approval, his security, feeling of security from the group, so as to destroy his ability to become an individual. And do you see what they tell the teacher here? The teacher has to encourage a general discussion centered around any negative behaviors that the children may report about themselves or that they have observed in other people. Does that sound familiar to you, ladies and gentlemen? It should. It's brainwashing. That's what brainwashing is. That's what the communists in the North Korean prisoner of war camps did to our prisoners of war during the Korean War. That's what they did. They said to our prisoners of war, criticize yourselves. And these 19-year-old students who hadn't been told anything by their teachers in their classrooms here in America about what our country's really all about, didn't know what they were supposed to defend, they began to criticize themselves. Then the communists said, that's good. Now criticize each other. They began to criticize each other. The result of which, of course, was that our prisoners of war lost all confidence in themselves, lost all pride that they had, all self-respect that they had, all military discipline that they had, and they lost all confidence that had existed previously between American soldiers because they were all criticizing each other. That's why you didn't read about any escapes during the Korean War. One guy's trying to escape, his buddy behind him is ratting on him to the communists, trying to curry favor because his buddy is trying to escape, committing a negative behavior, you see. That's what brainwashing was and is. The man who coined the word brainwashing is a journalist by the name of Ed Hunter. In his book, The Black Book on Red China, Ed Hunter writes as follows. He says, espionage and informing become the new way of family life. The children are given specific assignments to investigate their parents, obligatory under the school curriculum, and outlined in prettily illustrated textbooks. A field exercise may be entitled Studying a Family, and may give the child such tasks as bringing in secret information about father's source of income. Now that's what's going on in Red China. What's going on here? This is what's going on here. Here's a report of what went on, for example, in a typical government junior high school here in the United States. Here's a report of what went on, kept by one of the students in the class. He writes, we read Everyday Living. We are going to talk about families. Chapter name, You and Your Family. Family Income. Here is another one of these questionnaires that the kids are asked to fill out. This one is entitled, Your Family in American History. Your Family in American History. On this one, the student has to enter all sorts of detailed, complicated personal information about his family background. Then, of course, he sends this one up to the front where the teacher collects them, as she collects all these questionnaires that she is ordered to give out to these kids. This is my favorite, ladies and gentlemen. This is a questionnaire given to the kids in a government junior high school in Fort Lauderdale, Florida. Here are some of the questions that the kids have to answer. Do your parents consider themselves Republican, Democrat, or independent voters? Do your parents consider themselves liberals, conservatives, or middle-of-the-roaders? Have you ever heard either of your parents criticize the policy of the present administration? If so, could you give a description of the nature of the criticism that most stands out in your mind? How does that grab you? You see, ladies and gentlemen, the kids in the schools, your kids in your schools, are being turned into spies and they don't even know it, as in communist China. In other words, you're at home and you're talking to your husband, you see, and you make some statement about the current administration. You like this, you like that, or you don't like this, you don't like that. The next day in school, your kid is telling the teacher what you said that night. As a matter of fact, ask yourselves, suppose you tell a bunch of 7-year-olds, that's how old the kids who are subjected to this magic circle scheme, that's how old they are. Suppose you tell a bunch of 7-year-olds, sit around in a circle, talk about yourselves. Suppose that's all you say to them. What are they going to talk about? There's only 2 subjects a 7-year-old can talk about. What's going on now in school, what happened last night at home, right? He's never been anywhere else. It's the only thing he can talk about. If you say to a 7-year-old, talk about yourself, he's not going to say, Well, let's see. Last summer, the family and I took a trip to Paris. We went in and visited General de Gaulle. We had a very interesting discussion about French literature. General de Gaulle had said this and that. I said this and that. 7 years old. What's he going to talk about? The kids are being turned into spies, as in communist China, and they don't even know about it. Another technique for destroying privacy that the Pavlovian psychologists have discovered is this. They've discovered that if you can subject a consciousness to a profound enough, prolonged enough, intense enough shock, the consciousness subjected to that shock very often will open up before you, very often will no longer have any inhibitions, will no longer have any privacy, will no longer be able to keep anything from the person who is administering the shock. This is a discovery that Pavlovian psychologists have made. The Pavlovian psychologists that President Nixon's friend so admires. Now, suppose you wanted to figure out a way to subject a 12-year-old girl to a prolonged, profound, intense shock. What would be one of the best ways of doing that? One of the best ways of doing that, of course, would be to subject such a person to a prolonged, detailed, intimate, involved discussion of various sex activities in a group consisting not just of other 12-year-old girls, but of 12-year-old boys as well. That would be one of the best ways you could subject such a person to such a shock. Now, you've all heard these stories about these teachers who have been sent away to learn how to give this sex education. This brings us, of course, to the subject of sex education in schools. That's what we're talking about. You've all heard about these women. They're sent away to be taught how to teach the sex education. They come back and they tell you, I was shocked. And these are 40-year-old women. They have their own children. They have wisdom, they have experience, they've traveled, they have education. They tell you, I was shocked. Can you imagine what the effect of this type of thing is on the mentality, for example, of an 11, 12-year-old girl? If these 40-year-old, mature, sophisticated, understanding women tell you that they are shocked? As a matter of fact, don't you remember quite recently, a year or so ago, here in your neck of the woods in Connecticut, wasn't there a case, I'm sure you've all heard of this case here, Darien, yeah, remember that story? I don't remember the exact details. One of these ladies was sent to be taught how to give the training. She walked out right in the middle. You remember? They sent her to a motel, you see, to get friendly with her trainer. Remember? She walked out in the middle and came back and reported she was shocked. You can imagine what the effect of this is on the mentality, on the consciousness of somebody like an 11 or a 12-year-old girl. You see, ladies and gentlemen, this sex education that everybody is talking about today on one side or another, the people who are complaining about it, many of them, they think the purpose of it is to promote promiscuity, promote excess sex activities among the students. That isn't the primary purpose of it. The primary purpose of the sex education is to serve as a brainwashing technique, as a shock technique, a sensitivity training technique, to get the people who are subjected to this shock to open up their minds so that they will no longer have any privacy, you see? So that they no longer will be able to keep anything from the people who are administering this shock to them. That's the real purpose of the sex education. It doesn't really have anything to do with sex. The sex is just a smokescreen. The real purpose of it is to destroy the opportunity of the people subjected to it, to destroy their chance to have any privacy. How can we be at least relatively sure of this? One of the foremost inventors of these group sensitivity training sessions, that's what they are, was a psychiatrist by the name of J.L. Moreno. What does J.L. Moreno tell us? He writes, communists and fascists have a large repertory of dramatic, physical, spectacular, and super Machiavellian techniques of all sorts. Being without action techniques, the fraternity of social scientists has been taken by surprise. At last, we sociometrists stepped into the breach and developed psychological and social shock methods. There, as you can see, Moreno, the inventor, tells you that these sessions are shock methods. They are devised to introduce a shock into the consciousness of the person who is subjected to them. And ladies and gentlemen, not just 12-year-old girls are subjected to this type of sensitivity training shock. That is what goes on in the schools, of course, under the name of sex education. But of course, as you know, sensitivity training is going on. Oh, it's going on throughout the country. Adults of all sorts are subjected to it. It goes on in the Catholic Church. It's called cursillo. It goes on all over. In the schools, it's called sex education, among other things. The man who particularly prepared the soil for all this, says Dr. Moreno in his book, Who Shall Survive, was Professor John Dewey himself. Now, what do these invaders of privacy do with all this information they collect about you and about your children? Obviously, they haven't gone to all this trouble to concoct all these schemes, to collect all this information just to throw it away. What do they do with it? It goes on your child's cumulative record. You've all heard that phrase, cumulative record. Cum record, they sometimes call it for short. Every time a fact is drawn out of your child's mind about himself or about you, it goes on his record. As this record follows your child through the educational system, as more facts are withdrawn from your child, those facts are entered on the record. Until a full record, by the time he leaves school, a full record of him, of his private activities and yours, is available in the school files in your school and in school after school across the United States. As a matter of fact, ladies and gentlemen, the equivalent of 20 double-spaced pages of data on every living American can now be put on a single 4,800-foot reel of 1-inch tape. On one reel of tape, they can put 20 pages of data about every living American. Now, why do these invaders, these people who are complaining about invasions of privacy, why do these people who complain about J. Edgar Hoover, why don't they complain about this? Why don't they say a word about this? This is the biggest invasion of privacy in history. Never even mention it. They complain because J. Edgar Hoover may have happened to tap somebody's telephone because he suspected him of being a communist. You will remember, ladies and gentlemen, also, that the biggest single roadblock lying in the path of these totalitarians is the family which produces the child and sends him off to the school. And you'll remember my showing you the great hostility that these conspiratorial educationists expressed for that reason toward the family. In the Black Book on Red China, Ed Hunter writes as follows. He says, "Children are encouraged to denounce their parents to the authorities and even to testify against them to the point of demanding the death penalty. Communist publications contain constant references to this. Communist literature, and particularly the illustrated storybooks for the young, frequently have it as their theme. The cry, 'Kill him, kill him,' screeched in a thin, rasping voice against a parent by his or her small offspring, has been heard and encouraged in every community." Now that's what's going on in Red China, from the Black Book on Red China by Ed Hunter. What's going on here? Do you remember the incident on the campus at Kent State University almost a year ago in which those 4 unfortunate students were killed? Do you also remember who was on the campus a week before the incident? Jerry Rubin was there. Jerry Rubin made his new speech. What does he say in his new speech, for which he's paid $1,500 a shot? He said, "Kill your parents." That's his new speech. Kill your parents. He was on the campus at Kent State University a week or so before the incident in which the 4 students unfortunately were killed. He travels from campus to campus, makes the same speech. They pay him $1,500 a shot. He's on the campus because the people who run those campuses want him to be there. If they didn't want him to be there, he wouldn't be there. Exactly as in communist China, we see people, the students in our schools across the country, being encouraged deliberately to attack their parents so as to destroy the influence that the parents can exert on their children. Because the family is the big roadblock in the path of these totalitarians, the totalitarians have devised various techniques with which to attack the parents, as in this method, to neutralize the parents' authority, and to control the parents. Now, some of you are saying, wondering, I'm sure at this point, how could it be that a bunch of university students, these are university students, how could a bunch of university students actually sit in front of a man seriously and seriously listen to a man tell them, "Kill your parents"? What does it take to produce a consciousness which will seriously listen to somebody tell him like this, tell him to do something like this, and then treat him not as some bum who should just be kicked out, but treat him as if he were the great intellectual of the Western world? What do you have to do to produce a psychology which seriously will sit and listen to a man tell him to kill his parents? Here's the way you do it, ladies and gentlemen. Here's another very fascinating textbook. This one's called Into Your Teens. Into Your Teens. It's a hygiene book. This one is used in junior high school. It's published by Scott Forsman and Company. That, of course, is another one of the biggest textbook publishers in the world. Let's look inside this book, this is the teacher's edition, for the answer to our question of how you go about creating a mentality which will seriously listen to a psychopath tell him to kill his parents. On page 92 of this book, here's what the teacher reads. She reads, "Have pupils glance over the first 3 paragraphs of this section and let them carry out the suggested activity of jotting down their ideas about the reasons why parents may seem bossy or strict." 12 years later, that student who has been doing this assignment, which the teacher has just given him, is sitting on the campus at Kent State University listening to somebody tell him to kill his parents. What's the teacher really telling the kid to do here? Complain about your parents. See, here's the way it begins. Here's where it begins, in the junior high school. See, even earlier than that, this is junior high school. Complain about your parents. Dividing the children from their parents. Dividing your children from you. That's what's going on in your schools. That's where it begins. Very innocent, right? There's hardly anything to that. Complain about your parents. But a few years later, the person who's complaining about his parents is sitting on the campus like a zombie at Kent State University, listening to somebody tell him to kill his parents. This is how you go about creating these mindless zombies that you see smirking, leering, grinning in these colleges, these high schools. Take a trip over to your own high school here. Absolutely unaware of even what basic words in the English language mean. They'll be sitting there grinning, leering, completely unaware even of what side you're on and what side they're on. Sometimes they don't even know whether they're against you. They think they may be against you, then they think they may be for you. Here's the way you go about creating such a mentality. Complain about your parents. I also mentioned a moment ago that in addition to devising techniques to attack the parents, as in this technique, they've also devised techniques to neutralize the parents, destroy the parents' authority, the parents' influence over their children. How did they do that? They do that using the technique called family council. Family council. What's a family council? Well, we have to have democracy in our country, right? Got to have democracy in everything we do. Everything. That's got to be true. Supreme Court says so. It must be true. So we've got to introduce democracy into the family situation. Now, how do you introduce democracy into the family situation? You have it introduced into the family situation by introducing it in a technique called the family council. Now, what's a family council? Well, in a family council, you have democracy. Everybody votes. Now, suppose you have a typical American family. Father, mother, 3 kids. Suppose you say, here's what we're going to do. Suppose mom says, that's what we're going to do. Suppose the 3 kids don't want to do it. Democracy, right? Dad, you've got 1 vote. Mom, you got 1 vote. The 3 kids, they all have 1 vote. They're as good as anybody else. 3-2, they outvote you. They don't do it. Dad, do you ever wonder why the kid comes home from school, you ask him to do something, not only will he not do it, he won't pay any attention to you? It's the family council. That's why he won't pay any attention to you. Here, ladies and gentlemen, is a family council going on right now in the students' part of the book. You see, they draw a picture of a family council going on right before your eyes. This presumably is because the kid possibly won't be able to read about a family council because he's illiterate, because they haven't taught him to read. But the message is so important, they have to get it across. They draw a picture of one, see? Here's one going on right before your very eyes. Isn't it exciting? It's like a television series, see, like the Beverly Hillbillies. Now, Dad, you're probably wondering, Dad, who's this goofy-looking yokel here? That's you, Dad. Right here, see? And Mom, look, Mom, here you are, see? You're sitting right next to Dad around the kitchen table, the way you do sit next to him when you're having one of your family conferences, you see? Now, Dad, you're saying this. See, you're saying that. Then, Mom, you say all that. See, Mom's giving all those lines. You know, women talk much more than men, so Mom, she has to say all that, see? Then down here at the bottom, you got a couple of whippersnappers, you see? And they have as much voice as Dad, see? They have as much voice as their father. These rapscallions here, they're going to junior high school, see? Dad may be a college graduate. He's a man of influence in the community. He's got experience, wisdom. These people here, you see, they're going to junior high school. They have as much say about what goes on in the family as Dad does. This is why the kid won't listen to you, Dad. Here it is right here, family council. This is as dangerous as a case full of dynamite. It's more dangerous. Case full of dynamite, you can detonate, you get a big explosion. That's the end of it. This has a lingering effect, like arsenic poisoning. Family council, just another one of the techniques that they use in order to try to destroy your authority, destroy your influence in the family situation. I also mentioned that they, in addition to devising techniques to attack the parents, to destroy the parents' authority, neutralize the parents, they've devised techniques actually to control the parents, take control of the parents as well as the kids. Here's another very fascinating document. This is a report prepared by the PACE ID centers, they call themselves. It's a report of a conference held not long ago in California. The conference was financed and the report was financed by you. It says in the report that it was financed with federal funds. All federal funds come out of your paychecks every Friday night, unless I am mistaken. Let's take a look inside this PACE ID Center report and see what you paid for. For example, on page 42, we read, certainly, the first point that was made again and again is that workshops for parents in understanding their children seem to be an essential. Now, Mom, I know you thought when you came in here this evening that you did understand your children. You don't. You're really a mess, Mom. You need a workshop to understand your children. You don't understand your children. We can be sure that it says that in this federal report that you paid for. Now, do you remember what the plan was? The plan, as you will remember, the UNESCO plan included bringing Mom to school, right? They said, we'll bring Mom to school and we'll give her conferences, see? This will straighten her out. She's got this narrow family spirit, see? And in these conferences, we'll straighten Mom out. Now in this report, we're told that they're going to give you workshops, you see, to help you to understand your children. You think you understand them, but you're benighted. You really don't understand them. As a matter of fact, the latest scheme they are devising is a scheme in which they are preparing actually to take the children away from the parents. Ladies, haven't you been reading in your women's magazines over the last year or so, in every other issue you read, there's a great scientific discovery. Recently, they discovered that the prime learning year to begin learning is no longer 6. Now it's 2. Aren't you reading that, ladies, in every issue of your women's magazines? Now, they've made this great scientific discovery, ranks with the discovery of the circulation of the blood. Now, the prime learning year is 2. Why are you reading this in your women's magazines? You see, they discovered this. By the time the child gets to school, he's a middle-aged man of 6. By the time he gets to school, Mom has been sitting home with him for 6 years, see? And, of course, you all know this because it says so in all the psychology books. Mom's been sitting home. She's frustrated, neurotic, sex-starved. You see, she's sitting home. She has nothing to do with the time. She doesn't know what to do. She looks out for somebody to victimize, to destroy, because she has this pathological urge to destroy. The first person she comes across is her 2-year-old son. Immediately she goes to work on him, and she begins ruining his mind. She begins to talk to him about independence, pride, self-respect, privacy, patriotism, national independence. After 6 years of this, by the time the kid arrives in school, he's a middle-aged man of 6, his mind's completely ruined. Now the educators have been complaining. They have to spend the next 6 years undoing the damage that Mom has done during the first 6 years. They don't want to continue doing this, the educators say. So now they say they want to begin taking the kid into the school at the age of 2. See, Mom will be allowed to have the child and then wean the child, and as soon as the child's weaned, he'll be taken away into school. She won't have the opportunity to express her frustrations on her son, see? Then the educators won't have to spend the next 6 years of his life undoing the damage that Mom has done at home. As a matter of fact, according to the current issue of Time magazine, I read it on a plane, some plane or other, just the other day, they're going to start growing kids in test tubes pretty soon. We won't need any women at all. We can just do away with women completely. Won't need them. Just grow the kids in test tubes. So they've devised schemes, ladies and gentlemen, the goal of which is actually to take the kids away. In this same report, this PACE ID Center report, you paid for it, remember, we read as follows on page 25. On page 25, they tell us, in some countries, new or existing social institutions have taken over certain educational or child-rearing functions formerly considered strictly the prerogatives of the family. They have done this in order to increase their manpower potential or to unify the social and political identification of the society. Examples of this may be seen in Russia, Red China, and Israel, where to varying degrees the state rears the child. It would be expedient and wholesome if some agencies were formed to relieve parents of prolonged periods of stress by assuming some of the responsibility for the temporary care and guidance of their children. So the people who prepared this report, which you paid for, take as their inspiration what Mao Zedong is doing to the kids in communist China. This is their inspiration. The people who prepared this report held this conference, which you paid for. They're actually planning to take the kids away. Now, of course, Something like this actually couldn't happen, could it, ladies and gentlemen? This is impossible. Nothing like this could happen in America, could it? But it's already happening. Haven't you been reading during the last few days about this thing called forced busing? What's that forced busing all about? We're told that the purpose of it is to get quality education for young people. A black child will sit next to a white child. A white child will sit next to a black child. In some mystifying, magical, alchemical way that the chemists are unable to discover, the children will get some sort of a quality education just by sitting next to each other, you see? If you sit next to somebody with a different number of units of melanin in his pigmentation, you'll get a quality education. This is all there is to it. It's simple, isn't it? But what's the forced busing really all about? It introduces into the educational system the principle that the federal government has the right to take your child out of your home, send them away from your home, in some cases far from your home, miles away, to a place that you may not want them to go, whether you want them to go or not. That's the principle underlying forced busing. And that principle is being applied not just to white parents, it's being applied to black parents too. After all, black kids are bused just as much as the white kids are. In the South, as a matter of fact, and elsewhere, particularly in the South, there have been quite a few occasions where there's been a black school, and in many cases a brand new black school. You know, some of those black schools they just built in the last few years, they're brand new. Been a black school in a black neighborhood, and the federal district judge has said, we're closing your school. Black parents have said, well, we don't want our school closed. We're delighted with the school. It's brand new. What's wrong with it? Federal district judge says, I don't care what you think. We're closing the school up. He closes it up, takes the kids, sends them halfway across town. This is being done to all kids, black or white. Color hasn't got nothing to do with it. The color is just a smokescreen. The principle underlying the forced busing, ladies and gentlemen, is the principle that the government has the right to take your child away. It couldn't happen, of course, but that's exactly what is happening. As a matter of fact, President Nixon's good friend, Dr. Hutschnecker, recommended not only compulsory psychological testing, he also recommended rehabilitation camps to which children from homes that Dr. Hutschnecker doesn't like would be sent. As a matter of fact, doesn't President Nixon's welfare scheme include a proposal for daycare centers? Isn't that part of his proposal? Now, what do you think, if you let him get that installed, what do you think is going to be taught in those daycare centers? Well, obviously, what the establishment wants to be taught. They're running the show. What will be taught in there is what they want to be taught. And they are going to begin teaching this in these daycare centers, once again, to kids the age of 2 years old, beginning at the age of 2. Here, ladies and gentlemen, is another article from Today's Education, official journal of the National Education Association. This is an article from the issue of January 1969. In this article, the NEA speaks with approval of what they call mandatory foster homes and boarding schools for children between the ages of 2 and 3 whose home environment was felt to have a malignant influence. They are now reaching for the power to take your child out of your home if they think it's a malignant influence on him and to put him in a mandatory foster home whether you like it or not. The word mandatory, in case you've been taught to read through the look-say method, means compulsory, whether you like it or not. That's the authority that they're reaching for now. And finally, ladies and gentlemen, I've left the most incredible thing, as I should have, for last. In this same article from Today's Education, this is the issue of January 1969, here's what the National Education Association says. They say, biochemical and psychological mediation of learning is likely to increase. New drama will play on the educational stage as drugs are introduced experimentally to improve in the learner such qualities as personality, concentration, and memory. The application of biochemical research findings, heretofore centered in infrahuman subjects, such as fish, could be a source of conspicuous controversy when children become the objects of experimentation. 2 years ago, they said that they wanted to begin in these government schools experimenting on the kids in these schools, using drugs on the kids in these experiments. And ladies and gentlemen, what they wanted to do 2 years ago, they are now doing. These experiments are now going on in government school after government school across the United States. They're experimenting on the kids in these schools with drugs, as they previously experimented with fish, as they said in the article I just read from. Some of you came here tonight maybe because you're worried about the drug problem in the schools. You know, the pusher on the playground? The pusher on the playground is old-fashioned. Now the drug problem in the schools comes from the people running the schools. They are now doing just what they said they wanted to do. This experimentation is now going on, for example, in Chicago, Baltimore, Fort Worth, Omaha, Little Rock, the Bay Area, and San Francisco, going on all over the country. Parents are being threatened and intimidated in order to get them to acquiesce to allow their children to be victimized by these experimenters in the schools by giving them drugs. This is not medical treatment, by the way. There's nothing wrong with these kids. These kids are normal. This is mind control. The NEA says, as I just read you, these are experiments in personality, concentration. This isn't medical treatment, it's mind control. That is what is now going on, ladies and gentlemen, in school after school across the country. You will remember that the biggest complaint civilized men had about the Nazis in the Second World War was the experiments the Nazis did on the women in the concentration camps. Isn't that right? Remember those German doctors, they inserted foreign material under the calves of the women in the concentration camps? Then after the war was over, other doctors went to the German doctors. They said, how could you guys do this to these women? You're doctors. Remember what the German doctor said? Well, what are you complaining about? These are experiments for the good of humanity. What are you so up in arms about? Civilized people didn't buy that explanation. They shouldn't buy it now, and they don't buy it now. That's exactly what the people who run the schools are now doing to the kids, to your kids in the schools. One of the drugs they're using in the schools, by the way, is a drug called Ritalin. Ritalin is a drug that the Federal Bureau of Narcotics says is potentially addictive. The Federal Drug Administration urges extreme caution in the use of Ritalin. Ritalin is outlawed in Sweden. Can you imagine how bad this drug must be if it's outlawed in Sweden? The drug's outlawed in Sweden. They're using it here and the kids in the schools. Here, ladies and gentlemen, is an ad from a magazine called Psychology Today, very well-known, widely distributed psychology magazine. This is an ad advertising another magazine called Behavior Today. Here's a picture of a little kid. He looks like a kid 8 years old. The headline on the picture is Speed Freak. Speed Freak. And the ad reads, last semester, Jerry was so overactive that he could not stay in his seat, could not concentrate on his studies for more than a few minutes at a time, was generally irritable and occasionally hostile. He was lagging far behind his class, and he was a serious discipline problem for his teachers. Kid's probably a very intelligent kid. He was bored. That's what's wrong with him. What do they go on to tell us? The solution to Jerry's problem is speed, amphetamine. The particular amphetamine prescribed for Jerry is a powerful stimulant, which in large doses seems to cause symptoms in adults that it apparently cures in Jerry. Then in big letters it says, no one is sure why, but it works. Isn't that wonderful? No one's sure why, but it works. The amphetamine works on a collection of symptoms called hyperkinesis. The symptoms are caused by brain dysfunction, are found only in children, and disappear generally with maturity. In other words, if they left them alone, the symptoms would disappear. They don't leave them alone. They give them amphetamine, speed. They make them a speed freak. Now, you're told that the people in the schools are giving all kinds of drug education programs, to keep the kids away from drugs, alert them to the evils of drugs. What's going to happen to this poor kid when he reaches maturity after taking speed for 12 years? Suddenly he's going to stop taking it? This kid is going to be a speed freak. He is one now. This is going on in school after school across the country. What's the solution, ladies and gentlemen? What's the solution to the avalanche, the mountain of evidence I've presented for your inspection? And remember, we've only had time this evening for me to present just a part of what is already known. Well, the first thing to do, of course, is the thing that immediately occurs to you. Go to your school, investigate it. When you find out something going wrong, complain about it, take a greater interest if you haven't been taking an interest up to now. Make sure you read the textbooks, get more involved in the activities of the school. That, of course, is the obvious solution. Another solution that more and more people in America are turning to is the creation of private schools. The private school movement, ladies and gentlemen, I can report to you, is sweeping across the United States. It's booming. Private schools are established every week, one after another, somewhere across the country. Establish a private school. If you don't have one in your area that you like, that you can afford, establish your own private school. It isn't as difficult as you may think it is if you're hearing the suggestion for the very first time. If you write, for example, to Reverend Paul Lindstrom, you've heard of him. He was the chairman of the Pueblo Committee. Well, he also has established a private school in the basement of his church in Chicago. If you're not lucky enough to live near him, he's apparently prepared this little program, Basic Education Associates, he calls it. If you send him $150, he says he wants, he will send you all the textbooks, all the study guides, teacher guides, everything you need to start your own private school. When you run into problems, you can call him. He'll tell you how to solve these problems. He's been through the mill. He knows all about it. Much easier to start a private school than you may think it is. If you can't start a private school right away, consider the possibility, ladies and gentlemen, of simply taking the kids out of the schools and teaching them yourselves. One way to do that would be to organize the women in your neighborhood into a little faculty of your own. Now, if you organize any group of a dozen women, if you men organize any group of a dozen women, any group of women like that, you'll find 2 of them are teachers or have been teachers. Another 2 have been nurses or are nurses. Another one is a legal secretary. One worked in a radio station. Another one is a stewardess. That's probably pretty true of any group of a dozen women you'll find. Organize the women into a little faculty and make the women who are teachers the deans and let them educate the kids themselves. The kids will get a much better education from the mothers than they are getting from the people in the schools now. Now, most state education laws, as a matter of fact, our own state education law, the law of New York, paragraph 3204, most of these laws say that all you have to do to satisfy the law is to give the kid at least the equivalent of the education that he's getting in the government school. And since he isn't getting anything in the government school, that shouldn't be too difficult for you to accomplish. Here is what the New York State law says. It says, instruction may be given only by a competent teacher. Instruction given to a minor elsewhere than at a public school shall be at least substantially equivalent to the instruction given to minors of like age and attainments at the public schools of the city or district where the minor resides. You just have to give him at least what he's getting now. The first 8 years you have to teach arithmetic, reading, spelling, writing, English, geography, U.S. history, civics, hygiene, physical training, New York State history, science. Well, probably the group of a dozen women that you're going to organize, men, they could teach all these subjects. Maybe they need some help with science. You'd have to give them some help maybe with teaching of science, but all these subjects the women can teach. Organize the women into a faculty of your own and let the women do the teaching. Now, you may say at this point, you may be wondering, well, if we do this, if we take your advice, won't the state come down on us like a ton of bricks? The state will come down on you like 3 tons of bricks. Look, we're going for all the marbles here. What is at stake here are the lives and minds of your children. This is the most important thing in the country. There's nothing in the country more important than that. Nothing. Don't you think the conspirators are aware of this? If they are going to take over our country, they have to take over the kids first, the kids who are in a few years going to be running the country. There isn't anything more important. This is all the marbles. Of course they're going to come down on you like 3 tons of bricks. But if you are not willing to fight, to go to the limit for your children, well, you might as well give up now. You might as well just toss in the towel now. There's no reason that we should just put up a pretense of trying to prevent these dictators from imposing upon us. Of course they're going to come down on you like a ton of bricks, like 3 tons of bricks. And you have the duty, and I'm sure that those of you who are here tonight have the desire to do what you can to save the lives of your children. Now, along these lines, some of you may be thinking this, but suppose we do this, suppose we form a private school, then won't we be paying for the public school and won't we also be paying for the private school? It'll just be an additional expense. Sure it will be. And this is why here is something else I recommend you do. Form your private school, start getting your kids involved in education that you can control, and at the same time, form a statewide movement, which hopefully can be coordinated with other statewide movements, to demand of your state legislators in Albany that they abolish the government school system. Ladies and gentlemen, the problem that we're talking about arises basically because of government schools, because of compulsion, because you have surrendered to the government the power to take your children and your money by force. Compulsory, put in the same sentence with education, put in the same sentence with government, now shows us that all this means is that the government has the right to take your child away and to indoctrinate him with things that you may or may not want him to learn. That, it now becomes clear, is why the 10th point of the Communist Manifesto is a demand for government schools. Isn't that one of the points? Why do you think Marx put that point in the Communist Manifesto, made it one of the 10 points? Because he knew that a government school system is one of the best ways of keeping a population under control. The problem arises because of government schools. So the solution, ladies and gentlemen, many people, I can report to you, are beginning to believe this and think about this. The solution is to abolish the government schools. If you don't, sooner rather than later, the people who run the government schools are going to abolish your private schools. In a dictatorship, there are no private schools, right? Are there private schools in China? In Nazi Germany, were there private schools? Can't have any private schools in a dictatorship. All the schools are government schools. What would happen eventually, sooner rather than later, is that the dictators would abolish your private school. So you can't just stay on the defensive. You know, you're never going to win a battle by defending. The only way you can win a battle is by attacking. You can't just establish a private school. They're going to try to wipe you out. You have to try to wipe them out. Demand of your legislators that the government school system be abolished, be dismantled peacefully, because you, of course, are the bosses, are the employers of your employees in the state legislature. We haven't always had a government school system. Very recent introduction here, right? Only 100 years have we had a system in which they take the money from you by force and use it to construct a government school system. We haven't always had it. You allowed it to be put in, the government people allowed it to be put in, the American people allowed it to be put in, and you can demand of your state legislators that it be removed. Now let's compare just quickly, just for a minute or two, what would a private school system be like compared with a government school system? A system composed only of private schools. Let's compare first the cost. Now you pay for these schools all your lives, right? You send your child to school at the age of 6. You send him to school for 12 years. 40 years later, your child's a grandmother. Her grandchildren are going to school. You're still paying for her education. Then you retire. You're living on a retirement income, a reduced income. You're still paying for her education. She's finished with school 40 years ago. They're still taking that money out of your tax bill. It's the biggest item on your tax bill. You're still paying for her education. In a system of private schools, you would pay only for the service of education when you got the service, like you pay for any other service. You go to your doctor, he treats you, he sends you a bill, you send him some money. He doesn't treat you, you don't send him any money. Somebody tomorrow's going to come and take away your garbage. You'll send him a little money. If he doesn't come, you won't pay him. In a system of private schools, you'd pay for the education when you got the education. The tremendous amount of federal money that is now being wasted would be saved. All those billions and billions of dollars of federal money would stay in your pocket. That's where they come from in the first place. The money that is taken out of your local tax bill, that too would stay in your pocket, where it also comes from. Now, would people who have less money than other people be able to afford such education? Yes, they would, because in a system of private schools, there would be schools of all sorts of different prices. There would be expensive schools as there are now, like Choate. If you had the money, you'd send your kid there. There would be inexpensive schools as there are inexpensive cars. Why? Because businessmen would go into the business of education to make the hated profit. They would see a chance to make money. Reverend Lindstrom's making money in his school. They would go into the business to make a profit, and you know how they would make the profit? By keeping the costs low. That's how a businessman makes a profit. The businessman would keep costs low. Why? He's spending his money. The government school educator is spending your money. That's why the costs are high. He's spending your money, not his. What does he care? The businessman's spending his own money. If he can't keep costs low, can't run the school efficiently at a low price, he's out of business. You would have all sorts of different priced schools, and you would send your kid to the type of school that you could afford. Secondly, schools would have to please the parents, as in contradistinction to the way it is now. The schools would have to please the parents instead of having the parents please the school. I hope that isn't too revolutionary a suggestion for you, ladies and gentlemen. Instead of having to crawl in to request an audience with a Lord High School administrator, now the person running the school would come out and ask you, what do you want? What are you interested in? He'd have to find out. If he doesn't please you, you won't patronize him. Just as you don't go to the supermarket if you don't like the way the guy treats you, you go somewhere else. Today, the government schools have a monopoly. They don't have to worry about what you think. Just as somebody in business who has a different kind of monopoly doesn't have to worry about what you think. The supermarket manager does. He doesn't have a monopoly. The schools would have to please you instead of the other way around. And finally, ladies and gentlemen, in a private school system, we would have the great diversity that made our country the greatest country in history. You'd have all sorts of different schools. If you wanted to send your kid to a school that didn't have any prayers, you have that right. You'd send your kid to a school with no prayers. If you do want a school with prayers, you also would have that right. If you wanted to send your kid to a Catholic school, you'd send him to a Catholic school, or a Lutheran school, or a Jewish school. If you wanted to send him to a school which was based on a certain type of educational idea, you know, like the Montessori schools, you'd send him to a Montessori school. You would decide what type of education your child was going to get. But once again, ladies and gentlemen, there is no time to lose, because every day your child is in these schools, that much additional poison is injected into his mind. This is a matter of life and death. I realize I'm being a little melodramatic here, but I believe that the situation warrants a little melodramatic behavior. This is a matter of life and death. Every day your child's in there, a little more of this poison is presented to him. Finally, what we're up against once again is a conspiracy. The best way to destroy a conspiracy is by exposing it, and therefore I recommend that you join your local Motorede committee, your Mahopag area movement to restore decency, which of course is sponsoring the meeting here this evening, which is just one of a network of hundreds and hundreds of such committees established across the country to bring this life-saving truth to the American people. You'll find more information about the Mahopag Motorede committee on the literature table in the rear as you leave. Another thing I recommend to you, I've done it, I recommend it to all good Americans, this is that you investigate and join an organization created solely to prepare this great patriotic educational crusade, an organization which for that reason, of course, has been more denounced than any other in American history, but which time has proved to be right about every one of these problems we face in our country today. I refer, of course, to the greatest organization in America today, the John Birch Society. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Alan, for bringing us such a thought-provoking message. I think that all of us appreciate the warning and the challenge that Mr. Allen has presented. Now, ladies and gentlemen, Alan will return in a few minutes for questions that I'm sure you will have for him. I would like to ask all of you a question right now. And I'm going to ask it in all sincerity, much more than I have asked at any other meeting. Please join with us. We, for our small group, I can honestly say, have been very effective. Many of you sitting in this audience tonight know that. We've been in the papers numerous times. Our name is almost a household word throughout the community. Why? It's because we're effective. If we weren't effective, we wouldn't be a household word. It's as simple as that. And if we weren't effective, it would mean that we wouldn't be speaking the truth. What is the saying? Seek the truth, and the truth shall make you free. So please, join with us. If you're not completely convinced about what our aims are, please buy some literature in the back. We have a Motorede packet which, among other things, explains what our principles are. If you feel after reading it you can agree with us, please join us. There are application blanks in the back of the room. You can sign them by joining us tonight, or you can say that you would like to be notified of film showings. We have films on sensitivity training, which Mr. Stang mentioned tonight. We have films explaining exactly what type of sex education is proposed and is in some public schools. And we also have a film on drugs and how drugs are available and how they're being used to subvert the children of our country. So please join with us. Now, the annual dues are $2 per person. Now, that $2 does not entitle you to literature tonight. That, literature you will buy will be over and above that amount. Now, the major purpose of our committee is to get accurate information to the American public. And this is why we do have the literature in the back. We have a special Stang packet also in the back, which will, there are articles from American Opinion and Review of the News, which Mr. Stang writes for, and I think they'll be very interesting for you to read. I'm trying to think of, oh yes, that's it. We are going to be putting on film showings also, and that's the reason we would like you to sign these application blanks. Now, a brief description of our program is education and responsible action. We hope you will work with us on both parts of this program by reading, by attending a film forum, and by becoming an active member of this committee. Now, I would like to mention one school that has been formed in this area. It is not a John Birch school, but since Mr. Stang happened to mention that private schools are one of the cures, so to speak, of the problems that do exist in our government school systems, we have a school very close to us called the Heritage Christian School in Yorktown, and we have the member from the Board of Directors here tonight who, if you wish to speak to him, you can contact us in the back of the room at the literature table, and we'll put you in touch with him for any further information you might want to have about this particular school.